I stopped going to Margaret's birthday dinners the year I turned 52. Not because anything happened between us. Not because of a fight, or a betrayal, or a misunderstanding that never got resolved. I stopped because I was busy. That was the whole reason. And I told myself that was fine, that Margaret understood, that real friendship survives distance, that we would catch up properly someday when life slowed down a little. Life never slowed down. And Margaret died on a Tuesday in November, 3 years ago, and I found out from her daughter's Facebook post. I didn't even know her daughter had my name saved in her phone. I am going to tell you something that no one told me, and that I wish someone had forced me to hear when I was 40 years old and full of good intentions. I am going to tell you what it actually looks like from the inside, in real time, to lose a friendship not through conflict but through simple, ordinary inattention. The slow kind of loss. The kind that doesn't announce itself. I am 83 years old. I have outlived my husband, one of my sisters, and now the woman who knew me better than almost anyone alive. I have had 60 years of adult friendships, real ones, not acquaintances, and I can tell you with the certainty of someone who has made this mistake more than once, the most dangerous distance between two people is not anger. It is comfort. The belief that someone will still be there tomorrow because they were there yesterday. Margaret and I met in 1968, at a typing class neither of us wanted to be in. We were friends for 51 years. 51 years, and in the last 9 of them, I saw her 4 times. 4 times in 9 years. I want you to sit with that number before we go any further. The first time I cancelled on Margaret, it was genuine. My granddaughter had a fever, my daughter needed help, and I called Margaret from the car on the way to their house and said, "I'm so sorry. Next month, I promise." Margaret said, "Of course, go," because that was who she was. She never made you feel guilty. That was her gift, and I understand now. It was also the thing that made it so easy to keep doing what I was doing. The second time, I had a work obligation. I was still consulting then, hard time, convincing myself I was needed. The third time I simply forgot to confirm, and by the time I remembered it was the evening of, and I sent a message instead of calling. Just a message. Like she was someone I'd met at a conference. Not a woman who had sat with me in a hospital waiting room in 1987 when we didn't know if my husband would survive his surgery. She had driven 2 hours in January's heat to sit in a plastic chair and drink bad coffee with me for 6 hours. And I repaid that, 20-some years later, with a text message that said, "So sorry, crazy week, soon. Soon." I used that word for 9 years. What no one tells you about neglecting a friendship is that it doesn't feel like neglect while you're doing it. It feels like a temporary pause. It feels like something you're managing responsibly. You're not fighting. You're not being cruel. You're simply postponing. The friendship exists in your mind as a warm, intact thing. You think about Margaret and you feel fondness. You see something funny and you think, "I should tell her that." You hear a song from 1972 and for a moment she is right there, vivid, present. And you mistake that feeling, that internal warmth, for actual contact. You confuse remembering someone with tending to them. I was very busy tending to Margaret in my mind. In her actual life, I was absent. I didn't see this at the time. At the time I saw a woman myself who worked hard, who showed up for her family, who was responsible and dependable and good. I gave money to causes. I remembered birthdays with cards. I was the person people called in a crisis. I had a reputation for being reliable. What I did not have, it turned out, was the kind of reliability that matters most, the ordinary, untraumatic, showing up on a random Wednesday kind, the kind that doesn't look like anything from the outside. The kind that is just presence. Just being somewhere. Just taking the time. Margaret had a bad year in 2013. I knew this vaguely. She mentioned her knee in a message. She mentioned that her sister was unwell. I responded with warmth and concern and the sincere intention to call her properly that weekend. I did not call her that weekend. I called her 6 weeks later, briefly, while I was in the car between 2 other things, and I listened with half my attention and promised we would get together soon. Soon. She never told me how bad that year actually was. I found out at the funeral, from her daughter, that Margaret had been treated for depression in 2013 and 2014. That she had gone through it mostly quietly. That she had a small circle of people who knew, and I was not in it. I had been her closest friend for 40 years. And she didn't tell me. Not because she was angry with me. Her daughter was very clear about that. Margaret never said a bad word about me, never. She simply, and this is the part I have turned over in my mind every day for 3 years, she simply didn't think of me as someone who was available. I had trained her, slowly, over 9 years of sin and mixed month and crazy week, to not reach for me when she needed someone. That is the thing I have to live with now. Let me show you what 9 years of sin actually looks like. Not as a feeling. As a sequence of specific, ordinary moments that I can now see clearly, the way you can only see a road you've already driven in the dark after the sun finally comes up. Scene 1. March 2011. Margaret called me on a Saturday morning. I remember because I was making coffee and the light was coming through the kitchen window at that particular winter and angle that always made me feel like something good was about to happen. She asked if I wanted to drive out to the botanical garden. There was an exhibition she'd read about, old photographs, something about how the city looked in the 1940s. We used to do things like that. In our 40s we did things like that all the time, spontaneous, unscheduled, just because. I said I couldn't. I had things to do around the house. Genuinely, I had things to do. The gutters needed sorting and I had put it off for 3 weeks and my husband was away and I felt responsible. The gutters. I chose the gutters over an afternoon with Margaret. I told myself we would go the following weekend. We never went. The exhibition closed. And Margaret, I am certain, filed that away somewhere, not with bitterness. She wasn't built for bitterness but as information. As a small, quiet data point about who I was becoming and how much space she occupied in my life. Scene 2. Summer 2015. We had a lunch planned, a real one, in the calendar, 6 weeks in advance, at a restaurant we had been talking about trying for 2 years. I remember being genuinely excited. I bought a new blouse. I thought about what I wanted to tell her. There was something going on with my younger son that I needed to talk through with someone who actually knew him, who had watched him grow up. 3 days before the lunch, my daughter asked me to watch the grandchildren for the week. Her husband had a work trip and she was overwhelmed. I said yes immediately, without hesitation, without even thinking for one moment to say let me check what I have that week. I cancelled on Margaret by email. By email. After 6 weeks of a planned lunch and 2 years of talking about the restaurant, I wrote 4 warm sentences and signed it with a kiss and told myself she would understand because she always understood and that we would reschedule for September. September came. I didn't reschedule. Neither did she. And I told myself that meant we were both busy, that it was mutual, that this was just what adult friendship looked like. I believed this because I needed to believe it. Because the alternative, that I was the one pulling away, slowly, consistently, one cancellation at a time, was not something I was prepared to look at directly. Scene 3. Christmas 2017. This one I cannot excuse even with business sense. Margaret sent me a card that year. Handwritten, 2 pages, the kind she always wrote, specific, warm, full of small details about her life. She mentioned a trip she'd taken to Portugal. She mentioned a book she thought I would love. She mentioned, in one small sentence near the bottom, that she missed me and hoped we could find time in the new year. I read that card standing at the kitchen counter. I felt the warmth of it. I genuinely felt it. I set the card on the windowsill where I could see it. I looked at it every morning for 3 weeks while I drank my coffee. I never wrote back. Not a card, not a message, not a phone call. I thought about it. I composed responses in my head. I kept waiting for a moment when I had enough quiet to do it properly, to write something worthy of what she'd sent me. And every day that passed made it feel slightly more overdue, slightly more weighted, until the silence had gone on long enough that breaking it felt almost awkward. So I didn't break it. I told myself I would call her in January when the holidays settled. She didn't hear from me until April. A birthday message. 3 sentences on WhatsApp. She responded warmly. She always responded warmly. I don't know how she did it. I don't know where she kept the hurt, or whether she had simply stopped expecting anything different from me by then. What I know is that I received her warmth and I felt relieved, and I went on with my day, and I did nothing with the relief except spend it. 3 scenes. 3 moments where I chose something smaller than Margaret. The gutters. The grandchildren. My own discomfort with the silence I had created. None of these felt, in the moment, like a choice at all. That is the most important thing I can tell you. None of it felt like choosing. It felt like life, like the reasonable management of a full and responsible existence. It was choosing. Every single time, it was choosing. The funeral was on a Friday. Margaret's daughter had called me the week before, a brief, kind call, the kind you make when you are exhausted from grief and still forcing yourself to notify people because your mother would have wanted it done properly. She told me it was a small service. Family, and a few close friends. She said her mother had spoken of me often. She said that with such genuine warmth that I had to sit down on the edge of my bed and press my hand flat against my sternum because something in my chest had shifted in a way I didn't have words for yet. I drove to the church alone, 40 minutes through grey November drizzle, the kind that isn't quite rain, just a cold, persistent damp that gets into everything. I wore the black coat I'd had for 15 years. Margaret had been with me when I bought it. She told me to get the longer one. She was right. She was almost always right about things like that, and I had thought of her every winter when I put it on and never once picked up the phone to tell her so. The church held perhaps 40 people. I recognized almost no one. That was the first thing that struck me, how much of Margaret's life I had missed. There were people there who clearly knew each other well, who embraced in the particular way of people who have sat together through difficult things. A woman about my age who wept steadily and quietly through the entire service. 2 men from what I later learned was Margaret's painting class. She had taken up painting at 72, and I had not known this. Her world had kept expanding while I was busy, and I had simply not been there to see it. I sat near the back. Not intentionally, there was space there, and I took it, but sitting near the back of the church at the funeral of the woman who had been your closest friend for 5 decades is its own particular kind of verdict. After the service there was tea in the hall next door. I stood with a cup I didn't drink from and spoke to people who were kind to me because they could see I was struggling, not because they knew who I was in relation to Margaret. One woman asked me how I knew her. I said we had been friends since 1968. The woman's face shifted a small movement, just around the eyes, and she said, "Oh, you're Eleanor. She talked about you." I waited. She smiled carefully and said, "She said you were one of the great loves of her life. That you'd just grown apart. The way people do. The way people do." I set my cup down on the nearest table. I walked to the window and I looked out at the car park and the grey drizzle, and I stood there for a long time. Because what that woman had just handed me, wrapped in kindness, was the truth of what Margaret had made of it, of all of it. The cancelled lunches. The email. The Christmas card I never answered. The years of sin and next month and crazy week. Margaret had looked at all of that and reached for the most generous possible explanation. She had called it growing apart. She had made it sound like weather. Like something that simply happens to people, without agency, without fault. She had loved me enough to not make me the villain of the story. And I had not loved her enough to show up. That was the moment. Not dramatic. No raised voices, no revelation in the rain. Just a window. A car park. A cup of tea going cold on a table behind me, and the quiet, total understanding that I had been given something extraordinarily rare in this life, a friendship that could survive almost anything, and I had not survived it. I had simply not shown up for it. Repeatedly. Across years. Until the years ran out. She was gone. And I had been so careful to stay in touch. I have had 15 years since Richard died to think about what happened to my life. 15 years of mornings with no one else's schedule to organize, no one else's coffee to pour, no one else's needs arriving before my own, like uninvited guests who never learned to knock. And here is what I have come to understand. I did not sacrifice myself for Robert. That is the story I told for decades, and it is wrong not because it is too harsh on him, but because it is too easy on me. Sacrifice implies a moment of decision. A conscious choice made with open eyes. What I did was quieter and more insidious than sacrifice. I practiced disappearance. Every time I closed a notebook. Every time I threw away a job advertisement. Every time I answered the question, "What do you want?" with whatever you think is best, I was not giving something to Robert. I was taking something from myself. Slowly. Methodically. The way you don't notice a room growing dark until you can no longer read in it. I call it practiced disappearance because it was not forced upon me all at once. It was a habit, and like all habits, it began with one small motion repeated until it required no thought at all. The motion, in my case, was closing the notebook. There is a question I wish someone had asked me in 1958. Standing in that kitchen with the yellow walls and the smell of fresh paint and the telephone still warm from the call I had just made to decline the only offer that ever came dressed in my exact size. The question is not what do you want? Women of my generation were asked that question plenty. We simply had no practice answering it honestly. The question is this: what have you stopped reaching for so gradually that you've forgotten you ever wanted it? Sit with that. Don't answer quickly. The honest answer never comes quickly. Because the things we abandon rarely leave in one dramatic moment. They leave the way I left that publishing job, not with a door slamming, but with a polite phone call, a reasonable explanation, and the quiet promise to ourselves that there will be another chance. That the timing is simply not right. That we are being mature, practical, selfless. We are very good at naming cowardice with dignified words. I filled 23 notebooks that no one ever read. 23 notebooks of a woman who heard what language was trying to say the dean's words, not mine, and spent 60 years whispering it only to herself in the hour before anyone else woke up. After Robert died, I bought a 24th notebook. I wrote in it every morning. I still do. I am 90 years old and my handwriting has gotten small and my hands ache in the cold, and I write anyway. Not because it will become anything. Not because anyone will publish it or read it or call it remarkable. Because it is mine. Because I am finally, at 90, practicing the opposite of disappearance. I am learning to take up space. You are going to tell yourself that your situation is different. That you have real responsibilities, real constraints, real reasons why now is not the right time. And some of those reasons are true. I am not dismissing them, but let me ask you something, and I want you to hear it the way I wish I had heard it at 37. Sitting at Patricia Wren's kitchen table feeling more alive than I had in 15 years. How long have you been making yourself smaller for someone who has never once been asked to do the same for you? I am not telling you to leave. I am not telling you to burn anything down. I kept my marriage. I loved Robert, in the complicated, worn smooth way you love someone you have built an entire life beside. But love and disappearance are not the same thing, and for too long I confused one for the other. There is a version of your life where you take up the space you were given. Where you answer the question honestly. Where you stop reaching for the notebook and then pulling your hand back before anyone notices. I found that version at 85. I want you to find it considerably sooner. I still have the coat. The black one. The longer one she told me to buy. I put it on every November, and every November it fits exactly as it did the day she stood in that shop and said the longer one. Eleanor, trust me. I have worn it to 3 funerals now, including hers. I will probably wear it to more. That is the mathematics of being 83. The occasions that require a black coat begin to outnumber everything else. I used to think of her when I put it on. Now I think of the phone call I didn't make while I was wearing it. The walk we didn't take. The coffee going cold in a church hall in November while a woman I'd never met told me, with careful kindness, that Margaret had called it growing apart. The way people do. There is a woman in my building, her name is Patricia. She is 71. We have had coffee together perhaps a dozen times over the past 4 years, and every time we part we say we must do it again soon. I have not called Patricia in 6 months. I know this because I checked. After the funeral, after I came home and sat in my kitchen in the dark for a long time and then picked up my phone and went through it like an inventory of everything I had been postponing. 6 months. I called her the next morning. She answered on the second ring and she sounded genuinely surprised and genuinely glad, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing important and everything real, and when we hung up I sat very still for a moment because I had actually forgotten what that felt like. It felt like being in the room, not in a photograph on the wall. In the room. I cannot call Margaret. That is the word I live inside now. Cannot. Not later, not when things settle, not in September. Cannot. It is a small word and it is absolute, and it arrived without warning on a Tuesday in November, and it will not leave. But you can still make a different word yours. You still have the Tuesday,